For 7 years, Derek Hayes never stopped talking. He mocked his wife at breakfast, mocked her at family dinners, mocked her at business parties. And whenever his wealthy mistress was around, he mocked her even harder. "Look at Ellie," he'd laugh. "She's the only woman I know who can make poverty look like a hobby." Room would laugh, his mistress would laugh, and Ellie would quietly endure it day after day, year after year. What Derek Hayes didn't know was that his wife wasn't poor, she wasn't helpless. And she wasn't who he thought she was. Because somewhere behind sealed legal documents, hidden trusts, and a decades-old family secret, a $100 billion inheritance had been waiting for Grace her entire life. An inheritance she didn't even know existed. Then came the day Derek Hayes publicly handed her divorce papers to impress his mistress. He thought he was humiliating her. Instead, he handed her the reason to destroy him. Because while Derek Hayes was busy bragging about the Hayes fortune, Ellie was about to discover that she had enough money to buy every company his family owned. And when she finally revealed she had already purchased the empire his family spent generations building, the mistress stopped smiling. The investors stopped clapping. The Caldwell family stopped breathing. And Derek Hayes learned the most expensive lesson of his life. How did a woman who didn't even know she was worth $100 billion end up owning her husband's entire family fortune? And what happened when the man who mocked her nonstop realized he had spent years humiliating the woman who now owned everything? The coffee was fresh. Eleanor Hayes had made it at exactly 6:47 in the morning, the same way she made it every single morning. 2 scoops of medium roast, filtered water, the old drip machine that Derek had called an embarrassment at least 4 times but never once bothered to replace. She had poured it into his mug, the heavy ceramic one with the faded Columbus skyline on the side, and set it at his place at the kitchen table with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had long made peace with being invisible inside her own home. She was folding laundry when she heard him on the stairs, not footsteps exactly, more like an announcement. Derek Hayes descended every staircase in his life as though he expected applause waiting at the bottom. His shoes struck each step with deliberate weight. His hand trailed the banister with the loose confidence of a man performing for an audience he no longer respected. He was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's car payments, Italian cut, French cuffs, a pocket square folded with practiced precision. His hair was styled to look effortless, which had required 20 minutes and 3 products. He was, by any conventional measure, a handsome man. He knew it the way a hammer knows it is a hammer, completely, without nuance. Derek Hayes was the managing director of Hayes & Associates Real Estate Group, a mid-tier commercial firm headquartered in a glass-fronted building on North High Street that looked considerably more successful than it was. The company ran on his father's old connections and Derek's relentless performance of prosperity. The suit, the watch, the Audi in the driveway, the dinners at the right restaurants, the easy laugh at the right volume. He presented himself as a man of substantial means. He was, in reality, leveraged to the edge of financial catastrophe, balancing borrowed money across 3 overlapping ventures with the focused desperation of a man who understood that the moment he stopped moving, everything would fall. But Columbus didn't need to know that. And Derek Hayes was very good at making sure Columbus didn't know a single thing he didn't want it to. He picked up the mug, sipped, and grimaced with full theatrical commitment. "Is this from yesterday?" Ellie smoothed a crease from one of his dress shirts and set it on the pile without looking up. "Made it 10 minutes ago." He said nothing. He set the mug down and pulled out his phone, and within 4 seconds the grimace dissolved into something else entirely, a real smile, unguarded and warm, the kind that required a very specific person on the other end of the screen. His thumb moved quickly. The chat bubble visible for just a fraction of a second before he tilted the phone away was pink. Ellie folded another shirt. She was 34 years old, and in this house, in this marriage, she looked exactly like what Derek described her as to anyone who asked: simple, quiet, domestic. Her dark hair was pulled back without ceremony. Her clothes were clean and unremarkable. The only jewelry she wore was a thin silver band on her left ring finger, so plain it might have come from a department store clearance shelf. It had. She had chosen it herself. Derek had assumed that was simply all she wanted. He had made a great many assumptions about Eleanor Hayes. She had never corrected a single one of them. Her phone buzzed on the counter face up for just a moment, and the notification that flashed was from an application with no consumer branding. No logo a stranger would recognize, just a single stylized letter in dark navy blue. W. A transaction confirmation. Routine. Multi-jurisdictional. The kind of alert that, to anyone watching over her shoulder, would have meant absolutely nothing. To Ellie, it was the sound of a door locking from the inside. She glanced at it, turned the phone face down, and went back to the laundry. Derek drained the rest of his coffee standing up, keys already in hand. "I'll be late tonight." He said it to the room rather than to her, the way a man announces a flight delay to no one in particular. "Okay," said Ellie. The door closed. The house settled into quiet. She stood alone in the kitchen, hands resting on the pile of his folded shirts, and the expression on her face in that stillness was not one that grief or defeat could fully explain. It was older than either of those things. It was the expression of a woman running an extraordinarily long play, one she had been running quietly, methodically, without a single wasted move, who knew, with the complete calm of absolute certainty, exactly how it ended. She thought, not for the first time, of her grandfather Harold. She could still see him at the kitchen table in Akron, the pot of decaf between them, the rest of the house dark and asleep. She had been 9 years old, sitting across from a man whose hands looked like they had been carved from something that didn't break, and he had looked at her with the particular seriousness he reserved for things that mattered. "The wrong kind of people will always want what we have, Eleanor," he had said. "The right kind will never know we have it. Learn to tell them apart before they learn to find you." She had nodded carefully, the way children nod when they want to appear older than they are. She had not fully understood it then. She had been 9, and the weight of what she stood to inherit was still an abstraction, a number too large to attach to anything real, a future too distant to feel. She understood it completely now. Harold Whitmore had built Whitmore Industrial from a machine parts shop in 1959, with 2 employees, a government contract, and a stubbornness that his competitors had consistently underestimated and never recovered from. By the time Ellie was born, Whitmore Industrial was something vast and deliberately quiet, mining rights across Wyoming and Montana, pharmaceutical supply chains threaded through the Midwest, a logistics empire so embedded in the body of American commerce that removing it would have caused the kind of disruption that powerful people prefer to keep out of newspapers. Harold had never put his name on a public-facing thing in his life. He had structured the empire in layers, holding entities inside holding entities, jurisdictions chosen for opacity, a private family office in Zurich that managed the whole architecture with the discretion of a Swiss watchmaker. He was not a famous man. That was the entire point. Ellie's father Thomas had been gentle where Harold was granite, but he had inherited the philosophy intact. He had married Marie, a schoolteacher from Dayton who never fully grasped the scale of what she had married into, and raised Ellie in a comfortable but relentlessly ordinary house in a neighborhood where the Whitmore name meant nothing because no one there had any reason to connect it to anything. Thomas had died of a sudden heart attack the spring Ellie turned 17, but he had spent the 2 years before his death restructuring the entire Whitmore estate with the quiet urgency of a man who knew his time was limited. 12 holding entities, 7 jurisdictions, 1 custodian in Zurich, 1 beneficiary, Eleanor Margaret Whitmore. Harold was gone 14 months later, and the final layers of the estate transferred without ceremony or announcement: mineral rights, legacy industrial positions. 4 states' worth of real estate holdings, all of it flowing invisibly into the trust. By the time Ellie turned 21 and custodianship formally passed to her direct control, the Whitmore estate was valued at just over $100 billion. She had told no one, not a college roommate, not a close friend, not the man she had trusted briefly at 26, A man with kind eyes and careful questions who had turned out to be feeding information about her movements to a corporate rival. That particular betrayal had not broken her. It had simply confirmed, in the most personal language possible, every word Harold had ever said. When she met Derek Hayes at 30, she had not been naive. She had been tired. There is a specific exhaustion that comes from living a double life for a decade, from being, simultaneously, the quiet woman in the coffee shop and the sole-controlling beneficiary of $100 billion global estate. She had wanted, in a way she could not easily articulate, to rest inside an ordinary life, to be chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with what she was worth, to have someone be genuinely kind to her over breakfast without an agenda threaded underneath the kindness. Derek had been charming. He had pursued her with a warmth that felt in those early months like the real thing. He had called her the most real woman he had ever met, and she had understood, even then, the particular irony compacted inside that sentence. He had absolutely no idea how real she was. She had married him with open eyes, knowing he was flawed, willing to build something honest from imperfect materials. She had not anticipated the specific shape those flaws would eventually take. She had not anticipated Serena Voss. She had not anticipated what Derek was doing with borrowed money and Delaware shell companies while she folded his laundry and turned his notifications face down. But she had found out 8 months ago. And now she picked up her phone, opened the encrypted application with the dark navy W, and typed a short message to the only contact saved in it, NC, which stood for Nathaniel Cross, who had been her father's CFO before he became hers, and who was the only living person outside of a Zurich office building who knew the full truth of who Eleanor Hayes actually was. Delaware review ready to advance. Ohio asset position confirmed. Hold on Cayman until I say. His reply came back in under a minute. Understood. Timeline. She thought about Derek's pink chat bubble. She thought about the way he had not looked at her once this morning. She thought about a dinner invitation she had received yesterday from Virginia Hayes, delivered with the specific warmth Virginia reserved for occasions where she wanted an audience. Yet, she typed back, I'll tell you when. She closed the app, washed her mug, dried her hands, and hung the dish towel back on the oven handle with the small, precise care she gave to everything. Then she went upstairs to begin the other half of her day. The half that Derek Hayes, in 2 years of marriage and 1,000 mornings of fresh coffee, had never once suspected existed. Virginia Hayes had a gift for making invitations feel like summons. Her home in Bexley, a brick colonial on a tree-lined street, where the houses sat back from the road with the comfortable arrogance of old money, had been in the Hayes family for 31 years. Virginia had raised 2 children in it, buried a husband from it, and hosted her monthly dinners in its formal dining room with the unwavering conviction that the table she set was the most important table in Columbus. The silver was polished weekly, whether guests were coming or not. The wine was always decanted. The flowers were always fresh. Virginia Hayes believed deeply in the performance of a certain kind of life, and she had constructed that performance with the focused dedication of a woman who understood that appearances, maintained consistently enough, eventually became indistinguishable from reality. She was 64 years old, silver-haired and beautiful in the way of women who have spent decades being looked at and have arranged themselves accordingly. She wore a deep burgundy dress to her own dinner parties as a rule, a choice made once in her 40s and never reconsidered, because it worked. She had the kind of bearing that made younger women straighten their spines without realizing they had done it. She had never, in 2 years, asked Ellie a single question about her life before Derek. Ellie had noticed. The dining room was full by 7:30. Derek's sister Candace, 36, sat across from her husband Ross, a bank VP with a firm handshake and a habit of agreeing with whoever had most recently spoken. Candace had her mother's posture and her father's impatience, and she wore her wealth the way some people wear perfume, present, consistent, slightly overwhelming. She worked in interior design, which is to say she spent other people's significant money rearranging rooms and had built a successful enough practice that she no longer needed to be gracious about it. Derek's business partner, Mike Calloway, 41, sat at the far end, already on his second glass of something amber. Mike was the operational half of Hayes and Associates, the one who read contracts while Derek read rooms. He had a practical face and careful eyes, and he laughed at Derek's jokes 2 seconds after everyone else, in the deliberate way of a man who has learned to follow rather than lead in social situations. And then there was Serena Voss. She had arrived with Derek, which was its own announcement. She sat to his left with the relaxed propriety of a woman who had been to this table before, which she had, Ellie understood, on at least 4 occasions when Ellie herself had been given reasons to be elsewhere. Serena was 31, dark-haired, composed in the manner of someone raised to understand that composure is a form of power. Her dress was understated and cost $4,000, which is the specific price point at which clothing begins to look like it costs nothing at all. Her family, the Voss Group, a private investment firm run by her father Gerald Voss, had been in Columbus finance for 2 generations. She had an MBA from Wharton. She had a laugh that filled a room without effort. Virginia had placed her next to Derek. Ellie had been placed at the end of the table nearest the kitchen. The evening began pleasantly enough, the way all evenings begin before the thing inside them shows itself. Wine was poured. Virginia's housekeeper brought out the first course. Conversation moved through the comfortable channels of people who have known each other long enough to find safety in repetition. A property deal Mike was working. A renovation Candace had just completed for a Worthington client. The particular performance of ease that wealthy people use to fill the time between the moments that actually matter. Ellie ate her soup and listened, and said very little. She had a way of being present at a table without drawing attention to her presence, a skill she had cultivated so thoroughly over the years that it had become indistinguishable from her natural temperament. She watched Derek. She watched the way he leaned slightly toward Serena when he spoke. She watched the way Virginia refilled Serena's glass before anyone else's. She watched Candace track Derek's attention the way a person tracks whether nodding it, adjusting, saying nothing. Then Derek had his second glass of Barolo. It started small, the way avalanches start small. He told a story about a gala they had attended in the spring, a charity event for a children's hospital, the kind of evening where half the room is performing generosity for the other half. He told it well because Derek told everything well, and the story was funny on its surface, about a seating mix-up, a confused conversation, a minor social embarrassment. The person at the center of the embarrassment was Ellie. She thought the senator's wife was one of the catering staff, Derek said, laughing first so the table would follow. Asked her if there was a gluten-free option. The woman was wearing a Chanel suit. Table laughed. Ross first because Ross always followed Derek. Then Candace lightly, her eyes briefly touching Ellie's face and moving away. Mike smiled into his glass. Serena's laugh was the last and the warmest, and it lasted a half-second longer than everyone else's, which was deliberate, and Derek heard it and sat fractionally taller. Ellie picked up her fork and continued eating. In her defense, Derek continued, the performance now well underway, she doesn't really run in those circles. Different background. You can't expect. He made a small, generous gesture with his hand that managed to be more condescending than anything he had said directly. You can't expect everyone to know the room, you know. Of course, said Virginia. In a tone that meant the opposite, Serena turned to Ellie with a smile that had been engineered to look kind. Where did you go to school, Ellie? Columbus State, Ellie said. The half-second of silence that followed was the dinner party equivalent of a door closing. Serena just completed her MBA at Wharton, Derek said, as though this were relevant information Ellie had requested. Two completely different, he smiled at Ellie, the smile of a man being publicly generous to someone who should be grateful for the attention. Categories, not better or worse, just different, said Ellie. She reached for her wine glass and something passed across Virginia's face, a microsecond of curiosity almost immediately replaced by approval of what Derek was doing. Virginia lifted the bottle. "More wine, Serena, please," said Serena. The bottle passed Ellie without pausing. Derek, encouraged by the rhythm he had established, moved to another story. A shopping trip Ellie had taken where she had, apparently, spent 40 minutes in a discount home goods store. A phone call she had taken during a dinner with clients. The time she had mispronounced Chateau Margaux at a wine tasting, she said Margaux, he demonstrated, and Candace actually covered her mouth. Each story was small. Each laugh was real. Each one landed on the table like a brick placed carefully on top of the last, and the structure they were building together, Derek, Virginia, Candace, the agreeable atmosphere of the room was the architecture of a woman's complete diminishment. "She's a good woman," Derek said finally, reaching over and patting Ellie's hand with the theatrical tenderness of a man performing magnanimity. Simple, but genuinely good. Under the table, Serena's hand found Derek's knee. Ellie felt it, not the touch itself, but the shift in Derek's posture, the fractional relaxation of his shoulders that happened when Serena's hand made contact with his leg. She had learned to read him the way you learn to read weather. She knew every micro-expression. She knew the exact texture of his dishonesty by now. She set her wine glass down and looked at Virginia. "Which vintage is this?" Virginia blinked, mildly surprised to be addressed. "The 9 Sassicaia." "You should finish the 7 first," Ellie said pleasantly. "It's past peak. Another 6 months and you'll lose it entirely." Table went briefly, completely quiet. Virginia stared at her. It was the stare of a woman recalibrating, a small, involuntary adjustment, like a person who steps on a stair that turns out to be a different height than expected. Then Derek laughed, covering the silence with practiced ease. "See, she picks things up, like a little sponge." Polite amusement returned. The conversation moved on, but Virginia's eyes stayed on Ellie for 3 seconds longer than they should have, and Ellie, returning to her food, thought of the painting above Virginia's fireplace, a landscape she had looked at 50 times without comment. A mid-century American pastoral, oil on board, hung in a carved frame that had been in the Hayes family since before this house was purchased. The kind of painting that sits on walls for decades inside families who think of it as furniture. Ellie had looked at it differently every time she had been in this house for the past 4 months, not as a painting, but as an asset. She had commissioned a private valuation through a shell entity so remote from Whitmore Holdings that no one could have traced it back to her. The painting was valued at $340,000. It was one of 11 items in this house whose appraisal she now kept in a file she had never opened in front of anyone. The entire Bexley estate, the house, the land, the contents, had been used by Derek as collateral on 3 investment positions 6 months ago. All 3 of those positions were now held by a Whitmore subentity. Virginia Hayes was eating dinner in a house that, on paper, Eleanor Hayes already owned. She just didn't know it yet. Dessert arrived. The conversation softened into the comfortable murmur of people who have eaten and drunk well and are too satisfied to be dangerous. Ellie helped clear the second course without being asked, moving between the kitchen and the dining room with the quiet efficiency that everyone at that table had long since stopped noticing. In the kitchen, alone for 90 seconds, she took out her phone. A message from Nathaniel Cross sent 20 minutes ago. "Hayes Delaware entity 3rd tranche confirmed. He's fully exposed. Say the word." She typed back 2 words. "Yet." She put the phone in her pocket, picked up the dessert plates and carried them back to the table with a steady hand and a face that showed nothing. Derek was mid-story when she set the plate in front of him. He didn't look up. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. 3 weeks after Virginia's dinner, on a Tuesday morning when the Columbus sky was the flat, specific gray of coming November, Ellie sat alone at the kitchen table with her laptop open, and a call running through an encrypted line to a private conference room in a Zurich office building she had never personally visited but whose layout she knew from architectural drawings her father had commissioned in 1998. "Walk me through it," she said. Nathaniel Cross's voice came through clearly, the way it always did, measured, precise, with the particular economy of a man who had spent 40 years delivering significant information to people who needed to act on it. He was 58 now, had been her father's CFO from the beginning, and hers from the moment the custodianship transferred. He was the only person alive who held the complete picture. Hayes and Associates' full debt portfolio, originally held by First Federal Commercial, Nathaniel said. WMH Capital Partners acquired the entire note 60 days ago at a 4-point discount. First Federal was glad to be out of it. The paper was underperforming. WMH Capital Partners was a Delaware-registered entity 3 layers removed from Whitmore Holdings. Its beneficial ownership was documented in a Zurich filing cabinet and precisely nowhere else. Derek doesn't know, Ellie said. It was not a question. He received a standard creditor transfer notification from First Federal, routine language, new remittance address. He signed the acknowledgement without reading it. She had known he would. Derek had a specific blindness to paperwork that didn't arrive in the form of praise or profit. Virginia property, fully collateralized against 3 positions in the Delaware entity structure. All 3 positions now sit inside Meridian Asset Holdings. Nathaniel paused. Which is, as you know, a wholly owned subsidiary of WMH. Which was 3 layers from Whitmore, which was hers, Virginia Hayes's home, the Bexley Colonial, the Hayes family's single largest tangible asset. The house Virginia had leveraged without fully understanding the chain of entities her son had constructed around it, was collateral inside a structure that Eleanor Hayes controlled entirely. She had not done this in anger. She had done it the way her grandfather had done everything, methodically, without noise, in the full knowledge that a thing resolved in advance is infinitely preferable to a thing reacted to in the moment. 8 months ago, when Nathaniel had first flagged the pattern of shell company acquisitions tracing back to Hayes and Associates, Ellie had felt something shift inside her, not rage exactly, but a kind of final clarity, the specific feeling of a long question receiving its answer. Derek had found Whitmore industrial subentities through a third-party deal listing, undervalued positions that looked, to an amateur eye, like overlooked opportunities. He had not known they were connected to Whitmore. He had not known they were connected to his wife. He had borrowed money he didn't have, leveraged his mother's home, and begun quietly buying positions in the empire that had been Eleanor Margaret Whitmore's inheritance since before she was old enough to understand what inheritance meant. He had been trying to steal from the woman who already owned everything he was trying to take. The particular irony of this was not lost on Ellie. She sat with it for a long moment before she spoke again. Voss position, Serena Voss's family firm, the Voss Group, is co-signed on 2 of the Delaware positions. Gerald Voss's signature is on the preferred equity note. Another pause. That note was acquired by Meridian 6 weeks ago. Gerald Voss, Serena's father, the man who had shaken Ellie's hand at Derek's dinner and looked at her with the carefully neutral expression of a man dismissing someone owed money to a holding entity controlled by the woman he had dismissed. And the acquisition record for the shell companies Derek built, complete. All documentation filed. When those positions are called, the trail is unambiguous. He built the vehicle. He signed the instruments, he leveraged the assets. The whole structure now sits inside yours. Ellie closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about the pink chat bubble on Derek's phone at 6:47 in the morning. She thought about the pat on her hand, simple but genuinely good, while Serena's hand was on his knee. She thought about the way Virginia's housekeeper had poured wine past her without stopping, and the way Candace had laughed with her mouth covered, and the way Ross had agreed with whatever Derek said 2 seconds after Derek said it. She thought about her grandfather at the kitchen table in Akron, the pot of decaf between them. Learn to tell them apart before they learn to find you, she had learned. She had been learning for 25 years. And the lesson she had taken, the one Harold had meant and her father had lived and that betrayal at 26 had written permanently into her, was not that wealth was a weapon. It was that wealth, deployed with patience and precision, was something quieter and more complete than a weapon. It was resolution. Timeline for the call notices, she asked. We can move any time. First Federal transfer gives us standing. Meridian's board authorized the call provision last week. 30 business days from today. Send the formal notices on day 1. Don't accelerate. You want him to see it coming, She thought about this carefully. Want him to have exactly enough time to make one desperate, catastrophic move, she said. Because that move will tell everyone in his life, his mother, his sister, Serena's father, exactly who Derek Hayes is when he's afraid. I don't need to say a single word. I just need to give him enough rope. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. She had known him long enough to recognize the quality of his silences. This one was the silence of a man who had watched her grow from a 17-year-old at her father's funeral into something her father and grandfather would have recognized immediately. Your grandfather would have approved, he said finally. I know, said Ellie. She closed the laptop. Outside the kitchen window, the Columbus sky pressed down gray and still. Somewhere across the city, in a glass-fronted office on North High Street, Derek Hayes was at his desk performing prosperity for whoever walked past his door. He was leveraged to the edge of collapse. He was in love with another woman. He was borrowing against his mother's home to fund positions inside an empire he didn't know his wife had owned for 13 years. He had no idea. He had patted her hand and called her simple and gone back to his wine. She picked up her phone and sent one final message to Nathaniel. One more thing. The dinner Derek is planning for next month, the one he's calling a business success celebration. Yes, let it happen. I want Gerald Voss in that room. Derek had practiced the speech 3 times in the mirror that morning. He had done it the way he prepared for every important presentation, standing straight, maintaining eye contact with his own reflection, keeping his voice at the register of a man being regrettably honest rather than deliberately cruel. He had chosen his words with care. He had decided to be generous. He would acknowledge that Ellie was a good woman. He would tell her that it wasn't about her quality as a person. She simply couldn't offer what Serena could. Different calibers. He had decided to use that word, caliber. It was honest without being unkind. It was the word of a man who respected both women enough to be clear. He came downstairs with his suitcase at 8:15 in the morning. Ellie was at the kitchen table. He stopped. She was not in her usual clothes. She was dressed in a way he had never seen in 2 years of marriage. A charcoal blazer over a dark silk blouse, her hair down and precisely arranged. The kind of understated professional dress that costs more than it announces. She had her laptop open in front of her and a cup of coffee at her right hand, and she was sitting with the composed, unhurried stillness of a person who has arrived somewhere they expected to be. She looked, Derek thought, with a confusion he couldn't immediately explain, like someone from a different world. We should talk, he said. Yes, said Ellie. We should. Sit down. He sat. He began his speech. She let him give the entire thing without interruption. The Serena revelation, the 14 months, the regrettable honesty about caliber, the generous acknowledgement of her qualities as a domestic person. He delivered it cleanly, mostly as rehearsed, only losing the thread once briefly when she continued looking at him without any expression he could read. He finished. He waited. She nodded once slowly, the way you nod when someone has confirmed something you already knew. Then she turned the laptop screen around. What is this? Derek said. The document on the screen was formal and clean, a debt portfolio acquisition record. Hayes and Associates, First Federal Commercial. The acquiring entity, WMH Capital Partners, LLC, that's your company's debt, all of it. WMH purchased the full note from First Federal 60 days ago. I received a notice, routine transfer, remittance address. You signed the acknowledgement without reading it, Ellie said. I know, he stared at her. Who is WMH? Whitmore Holdings. The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Whitmore. My family's company, Derek. Silence that followed was unlike any silence the house had ever held. Derek's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, the beginning of something that wanted to be dismissal, and then stopped, stuck somewhere between them. She clicked to the next document. The Bexley Estate. Virginia's Colonial. The mortgage collateralization record, the 3 positions, the beneficial owner of Meridian Asset Holdings. Your mother's home, Ellie said, with the same pleasant, level tone she used to tell him the coffee was fresh. Fully collateralized against positions that are now held inside a Whitmore subentity. Those positions have a call notice attached. 30 business days, Derek. after which the estate transfers to satisfy the debt. You can't, my mother doesn't even know, she will soon. She clicked again. The Delaware Shell Company acquisition record. 8 months of Derek's careful, greedy, borrowed money positioning inside what he had believed were undervalued independent assets. Every instrument, every signature. You spent 8 months trying to buy into my inheritance, Ellie said. You borrowed money you didn't have. You leveraged your mother's home. You built a structure of shell companies to acquire positions in assets you didn't know belonged to me. And in doing so, in signing every one of these instruments, you transferred the entire vehicle into Whitmore's hands. She looked at him. You tried to take what was already mine, and what you built to take it with became mine too. Derek's face had gone the color of old paper. His suitcase stood beside his chair. His prepared speech was somewhere very far behind him now, in a version of this morning that no longer existed. Much, he said, and his voice was unrecognizable, all the performance stripped from it, the register of a man speaking from a place below preparation. How much are you worth? Ellie closed the laptop. More than you will ever recover from knowing. She stood, picked up her coffee, walked to the doorway and paused, not for drama. She was not performing. She had never been performing. That had always been him. But because there was one more thing, and it was only fair that he have it before she left. Derek. Serena's father, Gerald Voss. The preferred equity note his firm co-signed on your Delaware positions. That note belongs to Meridian. She held his eyes. Which belongs to me. Gerald has my personal contact information. His assistant called Nathaniel's office yesterday. I imagine the conversation between Gerald and Serena has either already happened or is happening right now. Derek's phone lit up on the table between them. He looked down at it. A text from Serena. My father is screaming. What did your wife do? Simultaneously, a call, his mother's name on the screen. Simultaneously, a call from Mike. Derek looked up from the phone to find Ellie already across the kitchen, her overnight bag in hand, her blazer straight, her face completely settled. Where are you going? He said, and it came out like a child asking why the lights were being turned off. Board meeting, she said. I've pushed it back 3 times. I can't keep Nathaniel waiting. Bored? What bored? She opened the front door. Outside, idling at the curb with the quiet confidence of something that had been waiting exactly as long as it needed to wait, was a black Escalade with tinted windows. A man in a dark suit stepped out and opened the rear door without being asked. Goodbye, Derek. Ellie said, not coldly, not triumphantly. The way you say goodbye to something you set down with the simple finality of a person who is done carrying a weight they were never required to carry in the first place. The door closed behind her. The Escalade pulled smoothly from the curb. Derek appeared at the front window, phone in hand, watching it move down the street. Behind him, his suitcase stood packed and pointless beside the kitchen table. Virginia's name still flashed on his phone. Mike's voicemail was already recording. Serena's texts were coming in clusters now, each one with more capital letters than the last. He pressed his hand flat against the glass. The Escalade reached the end of the street and turned, and as it did, the morning light caught the rear door panel for just a moment. A small embossed crest, dark navy on black, barely visible unless you knew to look. A stylized letter, W. The car disappeared. Derek stood at the window of a house he thought was his, in a life he thought he had built, staring at the empty street where his wife had just driven away in the full, terrible knowledge that he had spent 2 years mocking the most powerful woman he would ever meet. And she had let him do it every single morning over fresh coffee, while she quietly bought everything he had. His phone rang again. He didn't answer. Derek is standing at that window right now. Virginia's phone is ringing off the hook. Serena's father is making calls that will end careers. And Ellie Hayes, Eleanor Margaret Whitmore, is in the back of that Escalade heading to a board meeting to run a $100 billion empire while her husband stares at the street she just left. And this, everything you just watched, is only part 1. Part 2 is where Virginia loses the estate, where Serena discovers that the woman she helped humiliate owns her family's firm, where Derek makes one final, desperate move to get it all back. And what Ellie does in response will make everything you just read look like a warning. If you are not subscribed to this channel, Do it right now, because part 2 drops soon and it is the most devastating thing we have ever written. Hit subscribe. And drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching this from? We have people watching from Lagos to London to Los Angeles to Manila. Let us know you're here. This community is the reason we keep going. Part 2 is coming, and Ellie Whitmore is just getting started.